Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising as we begin a program, 5-day program on the future of God. We've never taken up this subject in this level of scrutiny before, although the term God and consciousness and awareness has infused all of our Humanity Rising sessions since the very, very beginning. So this is an opportunity to clarify terms and probe into the depths of the greatest mystery of all, mystery of divinity, the one. Before we dive into this vast and rich domain, I just want to bring everybody up to speed. I was very sorry I had to miss Humanity Rising last week, although I know Tom Eddington and Carson Kelly put on together a very powerful 5-day program. I'm here today, and then tomorrow I fly to Mexico City for our annual pilgrimage this year to Teotihuacan. We have a completely full house. We are expecting people from around the world. Everything is being prepared at the Pyramid of the Sun for the solstice. We have the Kogi elders coming in just a few days, and we are going to be preoccupied with Teotihuacan for the balance of this week and then all of next week. And then I'll have to see how my schedule is evolving from there. But I just wanted to greet everyone and say that while I'm absent, I may be sending recorded videos of our time in Teo, which I know is important to all of you and also to the students and community at Ubiquity University in light of the Kogi prophecy of last November, that this 6-month period between the winter solstice of 2023 and the summer solstice of 2024 is a crucial moment in humanity's reckoning, that we have no more time. We don't have till 2050. We don't have till 2030. We are now in the reckoning, and the earth is going to move to restore herself either with or without humanity. And the fact that we are spending our time rather than consecrating ourselves to the reestablishment of a caring and nurturing relationship with our planet, and we instead are devastating our planet, and we're devastating each other with equal ferocity. Every day for the last 8 months, the United States and Israel have been essentially engaging in mass murder in Gaza, and what the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice have said is plausible genocide. We have war going on in Ukraine. We have escalating tensions toward war with China. We have our governments at this moment of extraordinary crisis completely abdicating their responsibilities. And what we as citizens need to do is urgently clear, but not very obvious. We know that something must be done. And one of the things that I wanted to share with you about my journey over the last week, I had the opportunity to attend a gathering of the Pachamama Alliance convened by Lynn and Bill Twist, who have been on our programs several times before, especially Lynn. And they brought people together, I would say about 50 people together from around the world. It was an amazingly diverse group. And the question that we posed was, how can we, in the movement for a better world, think more deeply and act more creatively in a moment when all of us can see that the objective forces and conditions of the world are getting worse and worse? What do we do to turn this around? We broke into various working groups. I brought into the proceedings, as you might expect, the advent of humanity's ET moment and the fact that the United States government is now beginning a very laborious process of disclosing the reality that non-human intelligences and non-human technologies have been on planet Earth at least since 1945. And that there's evidence that's going to be forthcoming that we are not alone and that extraterrestrials exist. And we need to take that into consideration. Part of the group at Pachamama Gathering, which was down right outside Asheville, North Carolina, were shamans that had come up from Ecuador. And one of the shamans in particular had been trained by his mother, who's now 98 years old and living in the deep jungles of Ecuador and the Amazon, in the communication with the extraterrestrial beings. So he grew up with them as his friends and playmates even, who took him up in the spacecraft and brought him back down and convened. And then at some point in his early adulthood, they announced that it was time for them to go back to their home star. And he has since been frequented by other beings from other dimensions. And what emerged out of this discussion was this vision of connecting what I and many people are doing, focused on the national security state here in Washington, that's been holding this information as the most closely held secret, probably in all of human history, engaging in a systemic cover-up, engaging even in intimidation and murder of people who are bringing this information to the fore because they want to use ET technology to weaponize the ultimate weapon that can really destroy the bad guys and any perceived adversary. How do we link that national security state mentality with the vision of the original peoples? That these star beings have been here for thousands of years. They're here to help us in our ongoing evolution. As drop by strop, as Chekhov said, we squeeze the slave out of ourselves. They're here to help. They're concerned. And so that rather than seeing them as an object of fear and developing the technologies that the US has now developed to actually shoot the UFOs out of the sky, which we're currently doing, we rather embrace and we replace this notion of human supremacy that has guided our species from the very beginning with sacred reciprocity. And it occurs to me, having gone through this experience, that humanity is now encountering the first superior being that will subordinate human supremacy and may, if we open ourselves to the opportunity, catalyze a transition from being the alpha species to being part of the planetary and even the cosmic ecology of life, not as dominant, but as sacredly reciprocal. This is what's embedded in this moment. And I left the Pachamama Alliance just a few days ago and came to Washington before flying to Mexico City tomorrow for our event with Teo and the pilgrimage, filled with a sense of cosmic moment, filled with a sense of possibility. If somehow we can hold this extraordinary contradiction between the national security state that wants to keep this secret so they can develop the ultimate weapon. And this benign, positive, loving ethos of our relationship with the star beings. And what is pulsating in my heart and in my mind, how can we enlarge the scope of our awareness from the terrestrial to the cosmic? And how can we, in the spirit of Jung's great teaching, that it is the capacity of the ego to hold the contradictions, the polarities of life in a symbiotic relationship, and thereby experience what he calls the crucifixion of the ego, so that we can attain identity and resonance with what he called the great self. Are any of us capable of doing that individually? Are any of us capable of doing that collectively? I believe that it is upon that, the anvil of that question, that human destiny will be worked out, and that somehow humanity's relationship with these star beings is a key to the redemption that we seek. So anyway, I wanted just to share that with everyone, because it's just really motivated me and inspired me and made it more serious, the work that we're doing. And I just wanted to share that with you, and I'll do my best to drop in reports from Teotihuacan as we go through this extraordinarily momentous experience of being with the Kogi at the Pyramid of the Sun on the solstice, at this moment of prophetic reckoning. So thank you, everyone, for joining Humanity Rising. And now we get to the deep issue of does theism, does the Western notion of a theistic God have a place in our world as we evolve into our cosmic destiny? I want to welcome Tom Eddington, my very good friend and colleague, who put this whole thing together with Michael Putz, who he'll introduce in a moment. But Tom, I just want to thank you as a brother, tell you I love you in front of everybody, and thank you very, very deeply for everything that you've done to support Humanity Rising and the quality of the work that we are doing together. So thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. It's an unexpected delight to have you with us today. You and I spoke last week as we were doing the week on the folks from the Institute of Advanced Consciousness Studies, and I was expecting that you were going to be in Mexico. So, unexpected surprise to have you with us today, and delighted to have you in this conversation. I'm particularly happy to be collaborating with my good friend and colleague Michael Putz this week on putting this program together. Some of you may remember Michael. Jim and Michael and I did a program on artificial intelligence, and the question that was posed in that week was, with artificial intelligence and the acceleration of artificial intelligence, what it's causing us to question is, what does it mean to be human? And coming out of that program that Michael and Jim and I did together was the realization that with the questioning of what does it mean to be human, it led the three of us into a delightful conversation around the future of God. And to give you a bit of the sausage making process of Humanity Rising at times and putting programs together, it was out of that discussion of what does it mean to be human in the context of the introduction of artificial intelligence as we're seeing it in its current version, that Michael and I and Jim hatched this week on the future of God. So, Michael, I'll turn it over to you. Welcome you to frame this week that we're doing on the future of God, and just delighted to be collaborating with you.
Thank you so much, Tom. It's really a pleasure. And so Let's see, I'll share something that'll help us. Just a second here. Doing the Zoom sharing thing here.
I should be able to just share screen.
Yep.
There we go.
Oh, there we go.
And then just click on your presentation.
Can you see it?
And do slideshow.
Yep. Okay. Here we go. So, pleasure to see everybody. My name is Michael Putz, and sort of this question came up. It was, what's the future of God? And, can theism offer answers to the meaning crisis? And so the goal of today is to really set up 4 wonderful talks this week and give some context so these other speakers can get right into the work they're doing and how they're trying to help answer the meaning crisis, to do their part, their small part in trying to meet the challenges that Jim sort of outlined earlier today. So that's the goal of the conversation I'm going to have with Tom, is to really set up these 4 wonderful presentations by 5 wonderful speakers. So like I said before, back in Tom, is one of his many programs he organized was on AI policy back in February. And I gave one talk here about overlooked questions in AI. And basically my view was that AI is a godlike technology that requires us to wrestle with godlike questions. And that's what Tom was referencing, was the inspiration for the week. And just to give a little bit of context of where that came from, is that the central issue with AI is really, what does it mean to be human? Because if we're going to create new technologies that have some form of intelligence in them, then we need to basically we need to deeply investigate fundamental questions of ontology, formation. What does it mean to be human? How is this technology going to create value, make meaning, make decisions? Will it reflect human thriving or not reflect human thriving? Now, what's interesting about this is that at the same time as that we're having these conversations about AI, it's not in a vacuum. So it sounds great, but right now we're facing a metacrisis, and the metacrisis is leading to a meaning crisis. There's many programs on Humanity Rising talking about how responses to urgent issues like climate change, Jim was talking about war, potential ecosystem collapse. He was talking about the fact that we're really at a choice point in human history. So there's a lot going on. At the same time, there's really a mental health emergency in the West. And I'm speaking from a Western point of view during this presentation. So we have a combination of existential crisis, a mental health emergency, and then this is exacerbated by the fact that the ways we used to make meaning collectively have sort of fallen away. Now, we used to have in the West, some consensus about cosmology and meaning, and that consensus has progressively fallen apart over the 20th century into the 21st century. And for many people, that's a boon, because that way of making meaning left a lot of people out, may have been viewed oppressive, and did not reflect modern and postmodern insights. The challenge is that at the very moment we really need to have a shared sense of meaning to meet these challenges, the very nature of this has been undermined, because if you look through strict postmodernism, the very concept of meaning itself is almost impossible to grasp, right? It's very difficult for us to have anything other than a personal sense of meaning. It's difficult to create shared sense of meanings. It's like, you believe what you believe, I believe what I believe, but how do we pull together? How do we come together and create a new way of making meaning that's up to the challenges that, for example, Jim and other people have spoken about? So I call this loss of confidence in shared meaning making in the time of metacrisis. That's what I mean by the meaning crisis. It really is it's not an abstract question where we need to rally around solving some critical problems, but at the very moment we need to rally, we're sort of adrift in terms of how to make shared meaning. So just a bit of positive context here is that, look, haven't we been through this before? That's a common question people have, is like, we have some serious challenges, but we've been through these before. And I can't agree more in the sense of, we had World War I, a Great Depression, and World War II, and humanity navigated. That's a pretty serious metacrisis. And it led to a pretty serious meaning crisis afterwards. And we sort of got through that fairly well. So what's really different today? And I think what's really different today is that we have globalization, we have 8 billion people, we have climate change, we have exponential technologies. And what it really all comes down to is that we get bigger problems faster with less time to adapt. And that's really the question. So do we have a meaning-making structure that's robust enough to meet the challenges, these big problems that get big faster than they ever had before, and we have less time to adapt? And so that's the real challenge, I think, is that we need to have a way of making shared meaning that works for everybody, that works globally, that works across very different ways of knowing and being, and allows us to collaborate on a local, national, and global basis to meet these challenges. And I think many people feel that we don't have those frameworks. And so one of the things about this week is to have 4 different presentations by people who are really on the forefront of trying to make meaning that is robust enough that meets the challenges of today and can carry us forward. Now, for example, I think about some of the meaning-making tools that were part of my process when I was trying to navigate my own personal meaning crisis. And these are things that I would have picked up in the 80s and 90s, and they were very powerful and very important for me. But one of the things I would say about this is that as much as I value all of these tools and the gifts they gave me, I don't think they're robust enough to meet the challenges of today at the speed we need to. So I honor and celebrate this, and I honor and celebrate everybody's journey of meaning making that's come to today. But I think there's a sense for most of us that there's still we would like to have more. We would like to buttress our sense of meaning making, and also be able to figure out how do we then collectively get together and make meaning together. So this is the punchline. This is where the focus is, and we can unpack this for hours, for days. I really think that Tom and I have spoke about this. It really would like to have, it would take maybe another week or 2 weeks or more of programming to really address this. But the future of meaning making is developmental, participatory, and relational. And other people have spoken about this, but I think I'm just trying to highlight this. Many people here may know Ken Wilber, and he was known for his integral model. And I referenced one of his books here, Integral Spirituality. And one of the great insights he gave me, from the previous way of making meaning that when I first tried to go through my own meaning-making crisis and try to make sense of the world, I didn't have a developmental perspective. And I'll talk more about what that means. So I think Ken Wilber was a pioneer in bringing the developmental perspective into consciousness. He didn't invent the idea, but he popularized it. And over here is someone probably most people haven't heard of, is John Vervaeke. And I think John Vervaeke, there's just an incredible person and thought leader. John Vervaeke is a professor at University of Toronto, and his specialty is cognitive science, but he also has a deep background in Western and Buddhist philosophy. So he's sort of a Renaissance man in sense of being able to work in artificial intelligence. He works on cognitive science, he works in psychology, but he also has a very, very deep background in Western and Eastern philosophy. And he would be a self-described Neoplatonist. Now, I'm not going to go into describe Neoplatonism and the Socratic method and all that kind of stuff, but basically, he's deeply steeped in the Western tradition all the way back to the Greeks about how we cultivate wisdom. How do we discover meaning? How do we do this together? Okay, right back to Plato's Academy, right? How do we do this together? But how do we update that with all of the learnings we've had past the Enlightenment, past modernism and postmodernism, and do that in a rigorous way that allows us to do this in a participatory and relational fashion? And so I highly recommend John Vervaeke's work. He did a series literally called Waking Up from the Meaning Crisis, So he's done a series of videos you can find on YouTube. And he's done a series called After Socrates, and his latest work would be The Silk Road, where he's trying to use a metaphor for the Silk Road about bringing together all the world's great traditions, all the great tools for insight in a robust way that's up to the challenges of the 21st century. So I just want to highlight John Vervaeke's work and say it's an inspiration for this week. And to recommend people, if they have the time and opportunity, to explore his work. But I'll just sort of highlight what I think is relevant and give a snapshot of that in this presentation to sort of set up the week. And like I said before, Wilber's about really understanding the developmental perspective on meaning making, and Vervaeke's really sort of saying there's multiple ways of knowing that we need to engage in to meet the challenge. So let me elaborate a bit. So in terms of the future of God, can theism address the meaning crisis? And when I say in a postmodern way, when I hear Nietzsche from 1882 saying God is dead, what I really see when Nietzsche say God is dead is that the premodern conception and Nietzsche was speaking in the Western tradition. He was speaking about Christianity. He was speaking about the pre-modern conception of the Western God, in his mind, was dead. Clearly, Nietzsche was very deeply steeped in modernists, and he would have been a precursor to postmodern thinking in the 19th century. And from that perspective, the pre-modern God was not up to snuff. In some ways, the modernist and emerging postmodernist perspective had killed the pre-modern God. That God, in his mind, from his level of consciousness, was no longer adequate to what he could see and the challenges he believed he was facing. That pre-modern form of God didn't match the meaning crisis that Nietzsche was going through, and he sought his own solutions to that through his work. He was trying to make sense. He was trying to make sense in a modern and emerging postmodern way of how to make sense he was facing at the time. The crisis was created by industrialization, and that was pre-World War I. So the question is, which level of consciousness, what version of God are we talking about? But also, in what way are we trying to cultivate meaning and cultivate wisdom? And on the right-hand side here is just one piece of John Vervaeke's work. It's called the 4 Ps. And this is extremely important to me. And this is like where a lot of Western meaning making falls apart. He talks about the 4 Ps: propositional, procedural, perspectival, and participatory. And one of the things he just sort of highlights is that the Western ways of cultivating meaning and wisdom are very much overly focused on the propositional beliefs, concepts, ideas, right? And, for example, the Christian faith, oftentimes like Protestant faith, focused on the word. It focused on beliefs and creeds. If you assented to a creed, that meant that we could create shared meaning in the Protestant faith. I'm highly simplifying things, but propositional assent, propositional agreement was foundational to the process of trying to create shared meaning and shared community in the Protestant West, for example. Procedural rituals, how do we develop skills? And so the propositional ideas and concepts of procedural rituals, technique, how do we do things? Those are we're very good at that in the West. What we're not very good at is the participatory and the perspectival. How do we work together in a relational way to find meaning together? The West has had very much a hierarchical down, sort of top-down way of making meaning in the past, a very elitist project. And so the question is, how can we gain a participatory way of knowing? A way of knowing that would have been the way of knowing for all peoples before the Renaissance, before the Enlightenment, where people are much more embedded in nature. Indigenous cultures are by nature a participatory process of knowing. I mean, Jim was talking about the work he's doing down in Mexico. Participatory ways of knowing were foundational to foundational to indigenous ways of making meaning and creating wisdom. It's a very much participatory process. And perspectival. And the question is, from what perspective are we looking at the problem? And for example, you could say, what level of development are we seeing this from? Okay. And so that's sort of lacking in the Western view. So I think what's important here is that theism, the speakers you're going to hear through the week, when you look at their ways of making meaning and how they're trying to address the metacrisis we're facing today, they're looking through the lens of, they're trying to look through a postmodern lens where meaning is possible. We're no longer living in a world where there's no meaning and everything is, there's meaning, but they're trying to make meaning not in a pre-modern way. They're trying to make it in a postmodern way. And they're all trying to make meaning in a perspective, in a perspectival and relational fashion, collectively together. As many people say, they say, what is, people in Buddhism will say, what is the future of Buddha? And they would say, the future of the Buddha is the Sangha, meaning it's not going to be, we're going to find individuals. It's going to be a collective process of developing the wisdom of the future. It's not, we're going to be looking to singular people. And so, well, the people you're going to hear this week are going to be talking about a postmodern way of looking at the meaning-making crisis. They're going to be looking at perspectival and relational techniques as well as the propositional procedural. It's going to be a complete process. So I think it's really important when you look at what you see in the week, and you think through that lens of, and think about what they're trying to move forward. Some people have been, there has been some concerns that, just as a bit of context, that, sorry to sort of back up here, is that we're seeing the natural termination of the postmodern critique, which is critique only takes you so far. The question is, what do we create after we've critiqued all the failings of modernism and pre-modern thought? Well, what do we do going forward? If you just have critique, you end up with nihilism, right? And in the response to nihilism, some people have been trying to address the meaning crisis by going backwards. And sometimes we go, oh my gosh, well, they're going backwards to pre-modern concepts. And I don't think that's good, but I think we should have a lot of compassion. If we don't offer people ways of making meaning going forward into new and higher level perspectives, they're going to default to lower level perspectives. Our challenge is to have a robust way of making meaning that's postmodern that allows everybody to participate and belong, and it is credible and believable to a 21st century audience. That way, we won't have people going, either having to choose a perspectival nihilism or retreating to pre-modern forms of meaning making. I think that's what we have to step up to the challenge of working together to make meaning in a new way that's robust, so that people can have a way of moving forward into the future, as opposed to either being stuck or moving backwards. But at the center of all this is love. Now, I wish I could give credit to the person who came up with this chart, but this was an attempt to basically take, some people may recognize Ken Wilber's 4-quadrant model here, but I think what's really critical is that love was put at the center of this chart. And I don't think this is a sentiment or a Hallmark card. Love is really the center of all of this process. You may say the future of meaning making is perspectival and relational, but really at the center of meaning making is love. And some people may at a cosmic level say that the center of the universe is love as well. And so I think that's absolutely essential. It's not just a sentiment. It's actually critical. And I think when you listen to the people who speak this week and the ways they're trying to make meaning, please understand that I think you'll see that the center of what they're doing is love. And it's very, very critical. And one of the things I thought was missing in all the models and frameworks and ways of making meaning that I've engaged with for many years is there's not enough emphasis on that, on the emphasis on love. And so love is going to be to me is essential, but it's not, but alone, we have to put it in the context of the challenges we're facing. So, love isn't the sole answer. It's the center of all of it. But if we bring all this together, I think we really can create the future that we all want. So having said all that, I'd like to say these are going to be the people you're going to hear from this week. On Tuesday, you'll hear from Luke Healy. Luke is the founder of the Integral Christian Network, and he has been working on mystical participatory practices, and then having groups forming around the United States who are engaged in this and around the world. And I think it'll be very refreshing to hear each of these people's individual journey of meaning making, and each of these people have found their own sense of meaning making and wisdom, and each of them have a relationship with what they would call God. Now, again, what God are we speaking of, right? We're speaking about a postmodern conception of God that's emerging, that's participatory, that's relational, and is unfolding in an evolutionary way. So you're going to hear each of these people in their own unique way talk about their relationship with meaning, their relationship with that three-letter word God, and how they have made meaning and how they work with other people to make meaning. Like I said before, Luke is involved in participatory mystical practices. Paul Vanderklay is a Christian Reformed minister, but he has been deeply engaged in social justice since the 1960s, working internationally and locally with disadvantaged communities. And one of the things he's done is that he is, as part of his ministry, he has seen a sort of, I'll let him tell his story, but he basically ended up accidentally, through an interesting set of events, forming, in some sense, a YouTube ministry to many people who are under the age of 40, who have basically grown up in postmodernism, and they're going through their own meaning-making crises, and they've been seeking ways of making meaning. And Paul, as a Christian Reformed minister, isn't trying to evangelize simple Christianity to them. He's sitting in there in the process of creating something called This Little Corner of the Internet, which is a online community of people who are engaged, all faiths, and also people who are atheists, agnostics, people who are scientists, have no beliefs whatsoever, who are all trying to navigate this meaning crisis together. And Paul has done a remarkable job of working with other people like John Vervaeke. I discovered John Vervaeke through Paul's work. And he's done a remarkable job of building an online community that's collectively trying to answer the meaning crisis in a participatory and relational way. Jan Byers, she's known both to Tom and ourselves. She's a member of the Conscious Leadership Guild. And Jan is going to talk about her work, her personal journey from atheism to what you may call Buddhism, to a mystical Christianity, but not only talk about her own personal journey, but how that journey has led her to a work that she does with other people and the teachings she has, how she's been trying to address the meaning crisis in a very unique way. And finally, on Friday, we're going to have Bob and Gloria Rees, and they have been engaged in decades of working with multi-faith communities. And they also have been on their own journey of postmodern meaning making. And they're going to talk about that journey they've been on, and also how that journey has allowed them to be more effective leaders, allows them to do the work of serving the poor or helping out those in need. This is not an abstract question. The ways of making meaning, we talking about postmodern questions and meaning making and Ken Wilber and stuff like that may seem remote from the questions of meeting people's immediate needs. But as we try to develop communities across faiths, across perspectives, having this depth of practice in meaning making allows us to collaborate with all different kinds of people and do the work of serving other people's more effectively. And I think Bob and Gloria are going to speak to that beautifully and give us some wonderful stories from the front lines about how that's happening, their journey and the journey of other people, and how this work really does make a difference in a very practical way. So with that, I just want to give a little nod to the fact that I was only giving a glimpse, as much as it seemed to be a little bit abstract and technical. This is just a wonderful chart someone put together to sort of summarize, and I'm not going to try to walk through it, summarize just the pieces of John Vervaeke's approach to making meaning. And I want to say that he really is a pioneer in trying to merge together the best of traditional wisdom and philosophy and modern cognitive science. And on the left-hand side, you see these four ways of, of knowing, but there's a very elaborate set of practices that are scientifically based that he's trying to apply to the modern process of meaning making. And it's critical as critical as Jim said, because of the crises we're facing. It's also critical, as I mentioned before, because of AI, because we need to make sure that we're coming up with the most robust ways of making meaning, because we're going to have to embed this into the artificial intelligence systems we're creating. And it's important for us. It's important for us as we try to work together to solve the meta crisis and create the better world we want. And so with that, I'll say that this meaning crisis is new, but it's the scale and speed of the challenge is. The systems of meaning making in the West have been buckling under the strain. I would say, Jim might say, since the 1960s they've been buckling under the strain, but we certainly haven't we haven't met the challenge yet. And I think the way that we're going to meet the challenge is going to be developmental, participatory, and relational, and that love will be at the center of all of that if we're going to succeed. So with that, I think it's a good time to have a dialogue with Tom here about what you heard from this and any questions you might want to get from the chat for about the week.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. I really appreciate you doing the context setting for today and for the week. And I'm looking forward to our conversation today as we tee up the speakers and the conversations we're going to be having this week. And I'd like to invite Jim back into our dialogue today as well. And maybe where I'd like to start the conversation is, this week is titled "The Future of God." Yes. And, God has been an essential element to meaning making throughout human history in yes. various generations, various traditions. And I was recently reading Rabbi Art Green, a scholar of Jewish mysticism, who defines God. He uses the term isness, emphasizing the idea that it represents the pure existence or essence of being. And I'd love, Jim and Michael, if each of you could provide your definition of God.
Michael, why don't you go first since you're the program? Yeah, I'm waiting for the teacher to utter his pearl of wisdom.
That again, that's a week of theology. It's like I will tell you, somebody, actually, I've heard a number of major AI leaders say that the philosophy used to be the queen or the king of all the sciences in the past. Someone said, it was an AI, said, look, because I said, the AI is going to challenge our very nature of what it means to be human. He said that the future, that in the future, theology will be the queen of the sciences again, because we're going to have to answer these fundamental questions. I'm not going to try to go off and give a lecture about God, but I think the important thing about this week is this idea of, I'm not giving a set of propositions and definitions. It's about a participatory process, a participatory relational process where I discover God in relationship and participation with others. Now, I could give some abstract definitions about God being about the source of ultimate meaning, and I could talk about that all day long. But I think what's going to be critical is that people have this sense of the direct knowing and embodiment of that isness that Tom was talking about. And this source of ultimate truth, a source of ultimate meaning, the source of ultimate concern. And that's where I think God goes. But I think talking about God's one thing, but having this participatory discovery and knowing of God, that's the critical element in my mind. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. Jim, any thoughts from you?
Yeah, I think that what we're dealing with here in terms of the question that Michael has posed for the week is really not so much a contemplation of God. I think intuitively every human being understands God by whatever name as that container and intelligence that holds all things together as one, and out of which all manifest being emerges and then recedes. I think we all understand that in whatever way. I think that the crux that we in the West have to grapple with, as Michael indicated in his PowerPoint, is the question of theism as an interpretive framework for God. And I think what we're witnessing in our day, as Nietzsche predicted over 100 years ago, is the death of God. What we're experiencing is the death of theism. And just like Western civilization is going through its decline, as the United States imperium is going through its decline, the edifice that Judeo-Christianity and Islam have sculpted about how they perceive God is being tried in the balances and found wanting. And I'd like to make a very quick comment on this. Before the rise of Judeo-Christianity, the world consensus in antiquity was that we were in a pantheistic universe where God and creation were one, where the one and the many were interactive and interchangeable, where nature was, as the Taoist held the great Tao, heaven and earth and the netherworld, it was all one thing. And you could worship a stream, the spirit of a stream. You could worship the beauty of a horse. You could worship the dawn. And in everything in the manifest world, as the many refracted the one, divinity is present and can be discerned. What happened with Judeo-Christianity is they ripped that apart. And they said, no, our God that we worship is God, and your God is not. And two things happened. Two things were birthed into history. One is the notion of chosenness, that we're the ones that God has chosen and the rest are the Gentiles. You see that being played out today in the genocide in Gaza. Israel's basically saying the Palestinians don't have the right to exist. This land is only for us, the chosen ones. And the other, the corollary, which theism did uniquely, is it extracted divinity from nature and put it up in some being in the heavens somewhere. And the desacralization of nature meant that you can do anything you want to nature because it doesn't matter. And I think, Michael, that what you're describing in terms of developmental and participatory and relationship is really the way the West is trying to find its way back to pantheism. It's trying to find its way back to a cosmology in which everything develops together, everything is participatory together, and everything is relational together. And it's a halfway point. Einstein, I'll just conclude with this. Einstein was right. When he was asked these questions about theism and about God and the Western religions, he said in the future, the only religion that's going to survive is Buddhism. Why? Because it's only Buddhism in the Eastern metaphysical tradition that has a sense of wholeness. Jung made this point. He says at the root of the violence and the destructiveness of the West is we have no sense of wholeness. The East is about wholeness. That's what pantheism yields. That's what Buddhism yields, that there's no separate self. There's nothing that's separate, that everything is moving, everything is interpenetrating. That's the notion of dependent origination. Because the West broke out of that, what we have is the yin and the yang. We have the polarities, but we don't have the Tao. And Jung said, with Einstein, that this is at the heart of the Western predicament, and it's at the heart of the demise of theism, and at the heart of why Nietzsche said that God is dead. God isn't dead. The Western notion of God is dead. And we need to really take that in. And we Westerners, I think we need to find our way back to the East. And let me just conclude with Toynbee, because this isn't just me talking. When Toynbee, the great British historian who wrote his monumental study of history, when he was asked in the 1960s, shortly before he died, what was the greatest event in modern history? He said, it's the arrival of Buddhism to the West. Because this notion that there is no separate self is what is most fundamentally true. That's what enables a participatory, developmental, relational way of being. And theism has no place in that because it's based on the metaphysic of dualism. So I agree with Einstein, I agree with Jung, and I would posit that we're at this great moment where the New Age and all the progressive impulses in theology are finding their way back east. And it's very synchronistic to me that the death of God and the collapse of the American imperium and the rise of China and the rise of this new metaphysic of wholeness are happening all at the same time. There's a deep synchronicity that is accompanying the death of God in the West, because a new God, a unified God with creation, is emerging.
Well, yes, thank you, Jim, for that. And there's so much richness. I didn't want to touch the third rail of talking about what is God. I just want to talk about these wonderful people's experience of their ways of making meaning and discovering wisdom, right? But what I would say that, it's what you're talking about is a familiar process, and like Vervaeke mentions it in his work quite a bit. Is that we had what you were talking about is the two worlds mythology. There is the sacred world, and there's this world, right? There is the world of creation, and there's the world of heaven and meaning, right? And what we've seen is that two worlds mythology can lead to the two worlds mythology can also lead to the pathologies that you spoke about, right? And so the challenge is when you get rid of the two worlds mythology in the West, it's collapsed into one world, which is the secular, the material. And I'm not talking about Jim here. I'm talking about the Western consensus. With the death of that previous two world mythology, it was like, great, well, now we don't have a separation. Well, what we just did is delete the spiritual world and left us with the material world, which is nihilism, cynicism, things of that nature. And so the question is, what's the way forward? We're a Western culture steeped in Western ideas, right? And what's interesting is that I can't agree with you more about the pre-modern conception of God. As I said before, the interesting thing is that, one of the things Nietzsche wasn't. He wasn't a developmentalist. Nobody was really. Developmental perspectives weren't. That's a 20th century conception, right? And so I think the interesting.
Are you sure about that?
Yeah.
Are you sure about that, Michael? Because Darwin in the 19th century with evolutionary theory was part of a tradition started by Heraclitus that was inherently developmental. And my reading of Nietzsche, who I love above all philosophers next to Plato,
There you
is
go.
that his notion of the eternal return, his notion of life always changing was deeply developmental. And he was one of the first philosophers actually to work out in his own way, while Darwin was fresh in the Western mind. Again, what the Eastern metaphysics have known all along, that life is ever changing, life is ever evolving, and life is so interconnected that you can't make some separations. And that's his myth of the eternal return. But anyway, that's just a side point. But I wouldn't start developmentalism in the 20th century, even in the West. It's been a minority report since the pre-Socratics.
Well, it's interesting. I guess what I would just say is that, yeah, of course, we have to be careful like language and terms, and they're multiple meanings.
Yeah, for sure.
And so I'm talking about adult developmental psychology. Psychology wasn't a discipline until Freud. So basically adult developmental psychology is a relatively recent phenomenon, not the idea of evolution, not the idea of progress and things of that nature. I'm talking about the interior dimensions, that the idea that people did not speak about their philosophies and understand that they were speaking across different developmental levels when they were talking to each other, and that from different levels of consciousness, different things are disclosed. And so what I'm trying to say is a pre-modern conception of the world leads. There was this classic line in the Bible where they say, when I was a child, I acted as a child, I thought as a child, and I believed in God as a child. But when I became a man, I gave up childish things. And so the point is that as we grow, new things have been disclosed to us. Modernism and postmodernism have given us new insights that we cannot ignore, we cannot ever reject, we can't go backwards, right? And so the question is, is there higher stages of development where different possibilities, different forms of meaning and wisdom and different truths are revealed, right? And what I want to say here is that all the people speaking this week are on their own journey, and they're pioneers in discovering what you may call that unified sense of God. What does that look like, right? And a number of these people have come from a Christian tradition. Now, a Christian tradition that is more Teresa of Avila or St. John of the Cross or Eckhart or Meister Eckhart, right? The mystics. And from the question is, when those mystics, that the God that those mystics see is very different than the God that an institutional church speaks about, right? And so, and there's a very different way of meaning making and a very different form of wisdom that's disclosed in that process. And so we have the poverty of this word that's overloaded, God, we talked about, right? And ultimate concern, ultimate meaning, and ultimate consciousness. And so I think that what we're trying to do is we're feeling our way forward in this process. And I think we're going to have 4 wonderful presentations this week where people are going to show their pioneering work of trying to feel their way forward that doesn't go back to the old conceptions, not to the two world hypotheses, not to the God of Nietzsche, but to what this source of ultimate meaning is that they've discovered, disclosed, and found in community with other people.
Michael, maybe picking up on what you were sharing before, your perspective on the critical nature of participatory and relational. When I look at some of the metacrises that we're dealing with, whether it's COVID or climate change, in both cases, we witnessed in COVID exponential growth, and the human brain isn't capable of understanding exponential growth, which forces us to, and climate change the same. It forces us to tackle these problems from a participatory and a relational way. And I'm wondering if, when you think about the future, using those two as indicators of the need for participatory and relational, if there are other things you want to speak to, or Jim, for you as well.
Well, what I would say first, to reference what Michael was saying, Ken Wilber is a very good friend of mine. He's the chancellor of Ubiquity University. I've read virtually every book he's ever published and consider him a great, great thinker. But the great critique of Ken is also something that I embrace. And that is that this notion of developmental progress and modernism and postmodernism, and we're getting up there to turquoise and so forth and so on. Actually, if you stand it on its head, you get closer to the truth. It's not the case that the Aboriginals and ancient peoples were sort of at the bottom, and we've worked our way up and they didn't have a sense of interior. Some people say the sense of interior happened only during the Enlightenment, and that we're getting kind of more and more sophisticated. It's actually, in my view, and in the view of many, the other way around. Because the West got lost, because the West broke away from that ancient consensus that all was one, and that there's no separate self, and that the one and the many are all interconnected all the time in a great cyclic patterning of the cosmos. What we're actually doing is working our way back to that. So we think we're going up the ladder, and we think that the Aboriginals and the ancients are sort of primitives, and that we developed everything that's really important, like the interior. But actually, I just spent a week with shamans from the deep jungle of Ecuador. They have a much richer sense of the interior than we in our Western psychology. We're just finding out things that they've known all along. The classic case is science and physics, that because we desacralize nature, we said it's inert, it has no life, it's all atomistic. And now we're finding out that that's not true. And has been, I think it was said by one of the great astronomers that when science finally laboriously climbs its way to the top of the mountain, one scientific reductionist step at a time, who are they going to find at the top of the mountain? The Buddha, the seekers from deep antiquity who've been sitting up there the whole time. So I think it's really important, Michael, when we talk about God, we're talking about a phenomenon in the West that has been a result of us losing our way, and that the solution we seek is a return to the primordial, a return to the original peoples in the indigenous mind. Because as Andrew Bailey just said in the chat a few minutes ago, the reality is we are God. Jesus was crucified for saying that he was God. Al-Halak was torn apart by the muftis in the 13th century because he said, I am God. So that the most fundamental truth of our existence has been considered heresy in the West. And we've destroyed the planet. We're in the process of destroying each other because of the consequences of theism. And the quicker we can get back to that and turn Ken's beautiful integral theory and spiral dynamics on its head, and we understand that the journey is back to the primordial. They're not at the bottom. They never went away. So anyway, that's where I would start the conversation about God, is within the context of the actual reality of a unified cosmos. This may be my view.
Yeah, Jim, there was a post last week by Rabbi Daniel Gropper. He's the spiritual leader of Community Synagogue in Rye, New York. And in a translation of one of the passages in Psalms, he writes, "The beginning of wisdom is being in awe of all." it's his interpretation rather than the traditional interpretation, which is the beginning of wisdom is being in fear of God.
Yeah.
And he chooses a very different translation. And if we can arrive or find ourselves at that place of being in awe of all, it gives us a very different way of seeing the world.
Yeah.
And living it.
That's the Buddha. Buddha said wonder, he says, is the source of all searching.
Hmm.
I agree. Beautiful quote. But Michael, what do you think about what I just said? Because you've studied this far more deeply than me.
I would not say that, Jim. So you've opened up a can of worms, Jim. But there's so many things I could say, and there's not enough time. But one of the things is that it's first of all, I'm not good with quotes, but basically many people have said, I can't remember who I attribute to, that basically we take the journey, and when we complete it, we find we come back to the place we started. That's
Eliot and the Four Quartets.
Right. So it's a classic precept in Buddhism as well. We're already always enlightened, but we have to go on a long journey to discover that, right? We have to do arduous work, as some people would say, over many lifetimes to discover what we already always have been. So is the journey a mistake, a macabre, monstrous trick being played upon us, or a natural part of this human experience where there's the original wholeness you talked about that's already always awakened, that's in somebody? But they have to go on an arduous journey of discovering it, often a journey of differentiation and separation, to then come back to a more conscious unity, to return to that place as they say, I may have began that journey as a child, but come back as a mature, wise person, right? And that journey is necessary. And so in some ways, the East and the West, if I'm going to get cosmically metaphysical with you, since you brought it in, is that there's an interplay between the traditions of the East and the West. There are things the West has done the East has not done. And there's things that traditions of that we've created through this modern world that somehow absolutely are going to return to the wisdom, as you said, of the indigenous world. But somehow this journey we've taken has had some purpose to it. It has also had a lot of negative externalities, as you talked about before as well. And so somehow this journey of separation.
Not negative externalities, ontological, negative, that have been corrosive on the very soul of the Western world. These aren't externalities, Michael. This has to do with the flaws inherent in a dualistic approach in a unified cosmos. So anyway, I want to make sure that we're not talking about externalities here. We're talking about something that's intrinsic in the Abrahamic traditions. It's intrinsic in Western civilization.
I think we're saying the same thing, but
good. Good. Just wanted to check.
An externality people don't intend to create externalities. That's sort of the definition of them. And they happen to be, if you understand from a higher perspective, you can see them, right? That weren't the intention of the process. And so the challenge is I think that the critical thing for me is we're here now, Jim, right? That we've taken this journey as a human race, right? And so now the question is, what do we do today? And so I wasn't really thinking about the theological or philosophical definitions of God, or the history of it, or talking about the different how we got here. The challenge is we're here, right? And so the question is, how do we put Humpty Dumpty back together again, or maybe come back to the original wisdom we had? But we're coming back to that original wisdom from a very different perspective. There's going to be some value to the journey we've taken. We're going to have to bring together all of the indigenous traditions of the East and the indigenous traditions of the West with the learnings we've achieved in over the last 3,000-4,000 years on this journey we've taken. And we have to then practice it and put it in. We have to do this together and figure out what that future is going to look like. And I think that's the focus for this week. I know, so you've done an excellent job, Jim, of trying to explain some of the calamity of the Western approach that we've had in theism. And so the question is, what do we do now? And I think what I'm hearing from, we're going to have 4 different speakers who have a relationship to God in their own way. And they're trying to solve the meaning crisis, and they're trying to rectify the problems that you and other people have identified to help us take us forward. And I think that's really the focus of the week is, what do we do now? How do we learn? How do we do this together?
Yeah, I would agree with that to a certain degree, because I think it's, in my view, self-justifying to think that we needed to go through everything that Western civilization has done, and that somehow it was either ordained or it was a good learning experience, and now we need to do something else. I think it's worth considering that we made a big, huge mistake, and that what we need to do is apologize. And this is the point that V was making last year, that patriarchy can be viewed mostly by the men as a great learning experience, but it can also be viewed by the women who suffered it as a colossal mistake. And that in recognizing the damage that's been done, apology is actually the correct posture on the part of the West and the Abrahamic religions to the rest of humanity that have suffered the externalities that you are speaking about. And that if we had the humility to do that, we could really then begin the process that you're calling for of how do we do this together. But I think one of the reasons why we teeter on the brink of self-destruction is because the Western mind, the Abrahamic religions, are not capable of the kind of self-reflection that would bring us to our knees for what we have done. And unless and until we get to that point, I think we hastened our doom. And I would add just one more point, and this is why I've been talking about Gaza so persistently on Humanity Rising, because I think it has everything to do with our notion of God. And a God who's given this to us, not to them. This God who, with the doctrine of discovery, legitimated everything that the colonials did to the rest of the developing world as providentially sanctioned. And even till the present day, the Pope hasn't really apologized even for the doctrine of discovery, because inherent in the tradition itself is that Christian primacy, this Christian exclusivity that we're not yet quite willing to give up. Even the Vatican isn't really willing in the end to engage in the deep ecumenism that's required for the human race to come in together as one. So I agree with what you're saying, but I don't believe, in my view, that it can be done just by us saying we've had a kind of torturous journey, but we did it for the right reasons. We all got to learn, and now we're going to work together. I believe that the Western mind needs a reckoning and an apology, particularly to the indigenous people and the people of color around the world and to nature, that would have never happened had the Western theological, theistic traditions ever emerged. And so for me, the gateway that you're calling for is an apology.
Yeah, I'll just jump in, Jim, to say I don't disagree with you, but I think before the apology can happen, the underlying trauma needs to be tended to. And we look at Gabor Mate, we look at Peter Levine, we look at Thomas Hübl, and so many other thinkers who are raising the realization of the extraordinary amount of trauma that persists in the world. And until we tend to that trauma, we can't get to that apology that is so needed.
Totally. Completely agree. Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. And I would say that when you're talking about the we, and there's a very broad, that I would say that from my understanding of this community and also the people who are speaking, I think there's a deep sensitivity to the things you've been talking about from the people who are here, from the people who will be speaking this week. I think when you're talking, I think you're talking about the collective West as opposed to the people who are on this call.
Oh,
to
of
myself
course.
or to other people. I want to be very clear about that. It's like I'm not who is we and what is going on here and who's what's really important here is that we're framing the fact of what's happening in our culture, in what's happening in our world. And people are trying to grapple with solutions to the problems we have today. I wasn't trying to answer for the entire traditions of the West and what other people are doing and not doing, right, Jim? So I appreciate I appreciate how you're speaking up for the pain that this past has caused. And I think I'm deeply aware of it personally. I just want to let you know that I'm deeply aware of that personally, and also has gone through a tremendous amount of work on that in that area. And as Tom has said, I think the gateway for even for people who I think are very aware is, as Tom said, the deepest level of that is in some ways apologizing to ourselves for what we've done to ourselves, the journey we've been on, how difficult it's been, going through that individual trauma, even for people who are pioneers in this area. There's so much we have to have some compassion, I think, Jim, for ourselves and for other people about how difficult it is to really navigate this process. It's complex, it's difficult, and each of us is carrying our own cross, as you say, no matter where that cross came from, how we were given it through our collective culture, through our religious training, through our family of origin, through our ancestry. It's a very complicated picture. But I think what I want to say here, so I think you've offered some very sobering perspective, and I think everyone's on board with the fundamental insights of what you're saying. In some ways, we're the choir you're preaching to in some ways on these issues. But it's important here for me to say is to have not only have love at the center of this process, but also have a sense of forgiveness as well for ourselves and for our limitations, for my limitations, and for the limitations of where we are as a human species, West, East, indigenous, non-indigenous. In some ways, we're all in this earth ship together. And I hope we have 4 wonderful speakers this week who are really going to just hopefully give us some ideas about how we might navigate that future a little bit better.
Yeah, and I would just add one little note, and that is, I think the strand in the Western traditions that have never lost their connection or its connection with the primordial wisdom have been the mystical traditions.
Yes, Jim.
One thinks of the Kabbalah. One thinks of Meister Eckhart.
Yes.
One thinks of Rumi. One thinks of Francis of Assisi. The mystics have never changed because they've always known what was primordially true. And they have an exquisite skill in crafting those eternal truths within the metaphors and constraints of whatever orthodox tradition they find themselves in, sometimes more successfully than others. Been a lot of mystics that have been burnt at the stake. But I just want to acknowledge the mystical strand of the West that has kept lineage with both the East and the primordial visions of the original peoples. And that's what I think increasingly we need to embrace. And this is a point that Jung made. He said, the Western civilization can't just give itself up and go East. We're of the West.
Yes.
And so that the gateway to the East and the gateway to the unity that you seek is to move away from the orthodox, exclusive notions of truth possessed to the mystical notion of truth pursued, because it's in that mystery that we find our way back to the primordial and will enable us all to move forward to the future that I think you're pointing us towards. So I just really, I just wanted to bring that last little point
I think
in.
we've arrived. I said we've taken the journey, we've arrived back where we began, but in a different way, in the sense that I was not going to steal the thunder of other speakers, but so Jim said, I have to say that you'll hear tomorrow. There's been a classic line, Jim. So when I say about the future of God and the future of theism, there's been from a very practical perspective for the last 40 or 50 years, I can't remember the man's name right now, but it was a Christian who basically said, if there's a future for Christianity, it's mystical, right? But the problem is, it's not the future. It's always been the inherent. It has been the hidden tradition of the church from the very beginning that you're celebrating. There's always been this authentic mystical tradition. And so if there's a future, if there's a 21st century postmodern place for the Christian tradition, it is the mystics that have been there from the very beginning.
Yeah.
And I think that's really fundamental. And I would say, if you want to get a little bit meta here, is that Jesus, as the founder of that tradition in the West, has to be understood as a non-dual teacher. Okay, simply put, Jesus is a non-dual teacher, and Christianity was an attempt to try to convert that non-dual teaching into what could be understood 2,000 years ago. And the question is, I think the mystics always understood the non-dual teachings of Christ throughout.
And that's why he was crucified.
Right. So the point is,
you're absolutely right. He was non-dual in a dualistic tradition, and they said, "You got to go, buddy."
So here we are. So the question is,
absolutely,
how do we authentically engage in the 21st century with those eternal truths? Now, that's the point of this week. Is if there's a future of God and theism, it is the eternal mystical tradition, not necessarily the propositional views of people from the medieval times or 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago, or from the original monotheists 3,000 or 4,000 years ago. There is something in the West, as you said, that is beautiful, and we can't just simply, as you said, wholesale adopt the Eastern traditions. We can learn tremendously from them, but there's also the cultural heritage of the mystics in the West, who are also heavily influenced by the East. And so like someone like John Vervaeke speaks beautifully to this, right? And it's sort of interesting. The early days of Christianity, there was a synthesis between Neoplatonism and Christianity that's still lively in the Orthodox Church. There's been a very productive dialogue between John Vervaeke and the mystical elements of Orthodoxy. And they're trying to revive a Neoplatonism for the 21st century that integrates seamlessly mysticism. I think that's fascinating, Jim. Right? So that's I think I'm looking forward to, can we actually, the central teaching of Christianity people don't understand is that everyone was called to be a saint. We weren't simply here to obey, right? We were simply here to listen to a set of propositions. We were called to be saints. That's in the fundamental Western tradition. The question is, after all this breakdown, after all this pain, is there an opportunity to heed the call of the mystics as an average person?
Right.
Yes.
Yeah, the non-dual is what's true. And any path that leads away from that ultimately founders on the rocks of its own illusions. So I completely agree with what you said. Tom, give us a final word.
My final thoughts are just really, encouraging our audience to be with us all week. We've done a terrific job of framing the week, and I've been delighted that you were able to be with us today, Jim, and looking forward to a deeper, richer, and a more holistic conversation over the course of the week about what's in store for humanity and where do we have opportunities to be led, whether it's the wisdom of the East, the wisdom of the West, or the wisdom of the global South, and how do we integrate those three for the future of humanity? And I think that's where we'll find the future of God.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Michael. This is so rich. This is the conversation, everyone, that we need to be having. So I am very grateful for this unexpected opportunity to join in this dialogue as we get this week going. And Michael, I salute you for your integrity and courage to bring this very deep inquiry to our Humanity Rising community, because I think we're at that level of precariousness when we need to consider our most fundamental assumptions, and you're helping us do that. So I really thank you and acknowledge your mastery in doing so. So that'll bring us to a close for today, everyone. If you want to join Michael and Tom in the after chat, the link is in the chat box. You received the link in your Zoom reminder. Once again, I'll be out for the rest of the week traveling to Teotihuacan for the solstice ceremony the following week. But I'll be in touch as I can, and hope to see you soon afterward. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Michael. Bye for now.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.